My name is Monk Rowe, and we're filming in New York City at the IAJE convention. I'm very pleased to have Chico Freeman with me today, who is a saxophonist and a multi-instrumentalist and general doing what it takes to be in the music business. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, doing a few things
Yeah.
that are involved in the music business. Yeah.
So I had this feeling in reading about you that wasn't just the saxophone or just jazz that you were interested in.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a pretty varied background when it comes to music. I've been involved with different genres and types of music because I like all genres and types.
Yeah. When you grew up, I mean, you obviously had the influence of your father, but there was certainly lots of pop music and so forth going on at the same time. Which of it caught your attention first?
Well, naturally, like any kid, teenager, you grow up listening to the music that you grow up listening to. Right. And so I was no different, Yeah. So at first it was R&B, rhythm and blues, all the singing groups, because I actually sang in a singing group. I had my own singing group. I sang in a few. Did all the talent shows in high school. So I was listening to R&B, which would be Motown and the Drifters and things like that. I kept coming from Chicago. There was the groups like The Impression, Curtis Mayfield, Jerry Butler, the Chicago groups that were very. And Chicago was pretty much a hotbed of talented artists. I mean, Earth, Wind, and Fire comes from there. I went to school with them, in fact. Well, I didn't go to school with Maurice. He was older, but the Emotions, we were together in class, and we were in the same class. And a lot of Maurice's brothers, Freddie and Verdine, because Maurice had some brothers that were involved in Earth, Wind, and Fire. Yep. So I went to school with all of them, and so I grew up listening to that. That's what I started. Of course, at the same time, I was listening to my father rehearse simultaneously in the house. Yeah. So I was listening to people like Pat Patrick and Clifford Jordan, and they come by the house, and they'd be rehearsing with my dad and in his bands, Don Balthazar, Andrew Hill,
Wow.
Vernell Fournier.
Now these guys, pretty modern players too. I guess I had this impression that I have to readjust my thinking here with they were pretty up to date. In other words, they were not just playing swing.
No, but you see, my history goes even further back than that.
Yeah.
My father, my family, the Freeman family, my father has two brothers, and Buzz Freeman and George Freeman. Buzz is the drummer, and George is the guitarist. They all have played with Charlie Parker. But prior to that, at that time, they were the premier band in Chicago, the Freeman. And my father's a legend, and so are my uncles. But my grandfather is also one. He was one of the first black policemen on the Chicago police force. And my grandmother, my father's mother and father, Louis Armstrong lived with him when he came up from New Orleans. During that period, he was in Chicago, where he played with Benny Goodman, that whole Gene Cooper, that whole period when Louis lived in Chicago.
And King Oliver and all those?
Yes. He lived with, when he first came up, he stayed with my grandparents. And see, my grandfather was also a piano player. And so my dad grew up listening to Louis Armstrong play duets with my grandfather. And my dad and his two brothers, of course. My father was actually the first one to become a musician, even though my Uncle Buzz was older. He's the oldest of the three. But he also has another history because he was a Tuskegee Airman. And he also served with Percy Heath. Percy Heath is a Tuskegee Airman.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so a lot of history, And then my grandmother is involved in the church, she was, and she sang in the choir, and she sang with Mahalia Jackson because her church, which was called the Church of God in Christ, Bishop Ford, they actually named an expressway in Chicago after him. used to have these things in you know, Sunday church where in the gospel world, it's a very famous church. And Mahalia Jackson sang there, all of the great God, Clara Ward, all the great gospel singers. And my grandmother sang in the choir and sang with these people and played guitar. And that's what influenced my Uncle George to be a guitarist. So that's kind of, you know,
Wow.
kind of like that. So then I grew up in that environment, you know, when I was coming up. And
Quite a background.
yeah.
Did your father feel that music was a good profession for his son? Did you get that impression, or did he not? Did he kind of just let you?
He let me. I'd tell you, my mother. If you asked me about my father, but I'm going to tell you about my mother and say, she would say no. Clearly, she didn't want me to do it. My father didn't say yes or no. He decided if it was in me that it would, you know, that's the way it would be. So I never really got, you know, he always told me it was difficult, and it is. And but he never tried to really influence me. I did it on my own.
Yeah. Your mother probably would have been happier with a more conventional.
She would have, and I came very close
nature.
to it because I went to I received a 4-year scholarship for mathematics to Northwestern University, and I attended Northwestern. I graduated from Northwestern University. I went to get a master's degree at Governor State, but by that time I got my master's degree in music. But prior to that, I was going to be some kind of mathematician or actually I got involved in computer science, and I almost went that direction because I became a computer programmer. I programmed in like Fortran, Algol, and COBOL back in there, so the early languages of computers, and so I thought about it. But then I switched over to music while I was in school, so she wasn't too happy about that. But you know, she wasn't.
Remind me to ask you about the computer thing a little later in our conversation, if you would. I want to ask you about this when I read about you actually came to the saxophone later.
Yes, I actually played trumpet. Well, I played trumpet first, and that sort of happened. I don't know, the luck of the draw, you might say. My dad was in the Navy. He served in the Navy. Actually, him and Clark Terry were in the same band, the Navy Hellcats, and they were in Hawaii during, you know. And down in our basement, my dad had, you know, all of his Navy gear, and sort of stored in this little storage room down there. And my brother and I were down there, as kids do, going through everything we could find. I'm looking for his, you know, anything I could find. I found his bell bottoms, his Navy hats, you know, everything that, you know, duffel bags for this stuff. And we ran across 2 instruments, an alto saxophone and a trumpet. And it just so happened, I don't know how it happened. I just got the trumpet, just, you know, and my brother took the alto. And we were down there, we had found it, and my brother found a reed and put it on there, and I had the trumpet and was trying, and we were playing. My father was upstairs. He said he heard all this noise. He calls it bleeding and blatting, but he heard all this noise. He came down and found my brother, and I, you know, had found his instruments. So I joined the school band at that. I had been taking piano lessons first, though. I had been studying piano. I had a private, a teacher at the school I was going to gave lessons. So I had been taking piano lessons. But so then I joined the band playing trumpet. My brother later joined the band, you know, ended up playing saxophone. Then some years later, he switched to guitar, and I switched to saxophone. So that's sort of like how, and then he taught himself piano.
Yeah. I have to tell you, that's a very similar story that happened to the Adderleys. Cannonball and Nat.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
I
It's
can
almost
imagine.
similar thing happened.
Yeah.
So, did you get to use the horn in a professional setting at all? Or was that post-college? The trumpet?
Yes, sort of. I say sort of, kind of.
Yeah.
I went through grammar school and high school, and I was a little bit of a maverick, you might say. A bit of a nonconformist in a way. My father had always taught me to follow my own voice, my own, you know, myself. And that is a very, very strong concept that I think has always pervaded throughout this music. You know, particularly in the history of it, you know, that the individual and individuality and the originality is very important I think, to the character of jazz. And so my father had always encouraged me to do that. And when I was playing the trumpet, I kind of got, there was one trumpet player that was just got in my ear, and I couldn't get him out. I mean, I loved him there. It was a pleasant thing. But as I was playing, that's the only sound. I couldn't really get next to the other trumpet players in terms of tone. And that trumpet player was Miles Davis. I just had an affinity for him. I had seen my father play with Miles Davis and John Coltrane when I was like 5 years old.
Oh.
And I don't know. And then the first record that I ever heard that made me decide that I wanted to be a musician and play music, play jazz music, I should say, was Kind of Blue. So Miles Davis. And then the next trumpet player after him that I liked tone-wise was Nat Adderley. So they had, you know, the type of tone, that dark, brooding kinds of, because Nat played cornet, really.
Yeah.
So he had a darker sound. Now, the other trumpet players like Freddie Hubbard and Lee Morgan and Clifford Brown, they all had great sounds, but they were very big and more brassy kind of sound. And that wasn't the, and I wasn't into the marching band, you know, type of trumpet sound.
Yeah.
So my big influence was Miles Davis, and I was trying to get that kind of sound. And I ran into some problems when I was at college with the classical teachers there, because their concept of sound was completely different. And it really sort of got to me when I had this teacher. I loved this teacher. I had this trumpet teacher, and I liked him. He was a nice guy, and he was trying to teach me, and you know, I guess because he was so nice, I wasn't so belligerent. I was more trying to be persuasive and explain to him about what I was hearing, and maybe see if there was a way that he could help me achieve those goals in addition or alongside or somehow. And he really didn't have the information or the vision to do that. So I tried to help him do that. So I went and brought him a bunch of Miles Davis records. And he came back and he gave me he just told me Miles Davis played out of tune and this thing. He just completely dissed Miles Davis.
Credibility with you. Yeah.
So after that, I thought, I don't know if this is really for me, you know. I was beginning to doubt that. And then one day I was in class and I picked up an alto saxophone for, you know, studying. And because I was in music education at the time, and we had to study other instruments. And I picked up this alto, and something magical happened to me. And I did extremely well in this classroom. And when school break came, there was a tenor there that no one was using. I asked if I could take it home with me, and they gave me permission to do that. And so for the complete school break, which was about 2 weeks, I think, you know, spring break, I practiced about 8 to 10 hours every day. I didn't have a break. I mean, that's all I did every day. And I fell in love. That was it. I found it was my voice all along. And I was able to apply everything I had learned from playing the piano and the trumpet. And just, the idea was just to get the technique of the saxophone down and you know, the embouchure and all that. But as far as the musical knowledge, what I had gained, and that's what happened. So I came back and I finished my proficiency in trumpet, and I added saxophone, and I then joined the band in saxophone.
Wow.
They didn't think I could do it too, because the school was very, you know, good school.
Yeah.
And the people that came, they were pretty high-level players, and so when I came, I had to audition to be in a band on saxophone, and I did, and I passed the audition. Did everything. They couldn't believe it, but I did. Yeah. But it was magical.
Great story.
I mean,
yeah. So. I wonder what your father thought all of a sudden when he started hearing the saxophone coming out of your room 8 to 10 hours a day.
Well, it was kind of funny because I can tell you, well, he didn't hear it. But it was kind of interesting. He was conducting these jam sessions, you know, in Chicago, and I mean everybody that came through town came there afterwards, from Rahsaan Roland Kirk, Clifford Jordan, Sonny Rollins, you name it. They all came. They would work the places in Chicago, and afterwards they go to where my dad. And I used to go down there on the weekends and just listen. And I got exposed to like other players and from out of the city, from New York and other places. And I also would go there and play. You know, when I kind of got some courage and confidence in my improvisational skills. But I was playing on this classical mouthpiece. You know, Selmer C-Star.
Selmer C-Star.
You know it, right? And, you know, I was in the saxophone quartet at school, but, you know, I got up there on the bandstand. I think, if I remember correctly, I know it was my father, maybe Clifford Jordan might have been there, and a couple other people. And all these big saxophone, and here Chicago's known for big sounds, you know. And my sound sounded like I was tearing paper, you know. And I became totally, almost, it was disheartening, you know, because there was just no sound. I mean, it was great sound for the classical thing, but it was terrible for being there. So my father gave me my first mouthpiece that, you know,
could get you somewhere.
Get me somewhere. And I started doing that. So I eventually, later on, as I went through school, and I eventually graduated from Northwestern University with a major in music, a minor in math, and proficiencies in both saxophone and trumpet. That was what I ultimately ended up achieving.
At that point, it's like, now what am I going to do? I want to be a musician. I want to have a career in music.
Yeah.
Did you have a particular goal in mind, or?
I don't know. I don't know. After I got through college, I had met Fred Anderson, and he had introduced me to Muhal Richard Abrams and Bunky Green and Rufus Reed, because Rufus and Bunky happened to be going to school there for working on their doctorates, or on their master's degree, I think, at that time. And I had been offered positions by some corporations for computer work, you know, I think IBM was one that offered me a position, and there was another one, can't think of if I can think of the company's name, I'll tell you, they'd offered me a position. They were sending me American Express cards, you know, the whole deal, you know. Oh. And after I got out of school, I thought, I didn't want to go either way. I needed to, so I decided to go back home and hang out with my dad, because, and so that's what I did. So I started just hanging out with him and going to work with him and my uncle, and going to his jam sessions and doing that. And then I decided I wanted to go add to my education. So I decided to go for my master's. So I went to Governor State University to study for my master's degree. And while I was doing it, I had met Muhal Richard Abrams, and so I started playing in his band. And I started working in the AACM big band. And there I met people like the Art Ensemble of Chicago, Anthony Braxton, and, you know, the movement in that direction, and Henry Threadgill and Air. But at the same time, I was working, doing a lot of R&B gigs and blues gigs. I was working with J.B. Huddle and Memphis Slim, and, you know, I was in Chicago. I just sort of started falling into between going to school and working, you know, and having these gigs. And I started doing working with, there was a sort of a fusion band that I called Street Dancer. I started working with some guys.
Define fusion for me at that time.
This was, you know, playing in 9s and 7s, and it was sort of, well, this guy was a Polish guy, Stankowski, it's hard to remember his name. And in Chicago, and I started playing these on the north side, these sort of, those kind of places, those kinds of gigs. And I met a guy named Kenny Elliott, who's now with Lou Rawls. Has been with Lou Rawls for, I don't know, for a long time. But Kenny and I, and then I got involved with Earth, Wind and Fire when Maurice White had left. He had been with Ramsey Lewis for like the Ramsey Lewis trio, and then he left and he started his own band. And there was some Chicago a guy named Oscar Bashir and Sherry Scott and some other people. And I played with them for a minute, and then I was working around, like I said, doing the blues gigs, R&B gigs, and some jazz gigs with my uncle, and studying and jamming, and just I was filled with music, you know. I was like all day, every day, either practicing or, you know. So that was pretty good. And I was studying composition with Muhal, as well as being a part of his band. Yeah. And then I decided to go to school at Governor State University. And when I went there, this was great because all the things I was doing was kind of a university that also, at that time, they called it University Without Walls. You were allowed to have a certain number of instructors that were not that could teach you things that you wanted to learn, but they did not have to be a part of the university structure. So I was able to really study serious, in-depth composition with Muhammad Richard Abrams, who was a great composer, and get college credit for it. So I was, everything was kind of working. And then the band joined performed at the Notre Dame Intercollegiate Jazz Festival, which all the schools, you know, North Texas State, Richmond, up in Virginia. I'm trying to think. Raymond Ricker teaches there. I'm trying to think. Eastman. Yeah. Eastman. All of these, you know, across the country. And the director of the band was Warwick Carter, who, and I was in this great band. We had a great band because we had some of the professional musicians who were working, you know, in Chicago in this band. This band was tough. And we won the award for Best Band. I won 2 awards, Best Saxophonist and Best Soloist. And we won Best, another guy won Best Composer, I think, and we won both Best Vocalist, I think. Wow. So we won 5 awards. We took nearly all of it. And it was great. And because of that, there was this program that the governor of Illinois had, sort of an exchange program with the governor of Sao Paulo, Brazil. So I went to Brazil as a result of that, you know, and stayed down there. They sent someone up here. And
I see.
Yeah. So that was all during my school, you know, working on for my master's degree. Warwick Carter eventually became the head of Berkeley in Boston. He's not there now. I think he's back in Chicago now teaching at another place, but I just ran into him here.
Was the association with Muhammad Richard Abrams, he was pretty modern, I mean, pretty progressive, that whole contingent of players. Is that right?
Yes.
And did you like that kind of freedom in your music?
Yes, I did. I mean, it was a new thing for me. I mean, I had been playing a lot of straight ahead and, you know, pretty mainstream, I guess. Yeah. Along with a lot of the R&B stuff, you know, and things like that. When I met him, though, he showed me new ways of doing things, which was quite startling in a way. You know, actually, it sort of got to me because his way of teaching was as modern as he is. His way of teaching was always to go back in history. From him, I learned more about the history of jazz than anything else, than anyone else. He took me back to Willie the Lion Smith and James P. Johnson and Louis Armstrong. I used to have to transcribe their solos. I mean, the things I had to do with him, you would think, a lot of people would think, because of Muhammad's reputation in his music, that he being so modern, you know, that this was not like, but he's very versed on the history of the music, you know, in all aspects, historically speaking as well as musically speaking. And so that's what I was studying with him and doing that. And in showing me these things, because he always said, if you don't study the history, you're bound to repeat it. And if you want to do things different, you have to first know the rules to break them and all of that. So that was his premise that he operated from. And so it was a great experience for me. Yeah. Yeah.
When was the first time you got to record?
That's kind of interesting. I kind of recorded 3 albums almost simultaneously. It was a little unusual. The AACM, which is the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, had garnered some attention from the Japanese in Chicago at this movement, and there were some Japanese record companies that were coming over and recording. A lot of guys, Muhal was doing records, and Henry and everyone. And I had caught their eye as well. And there was a guy who came over, and I was in New York. Actually, when I left Brazil, I came to New York, and I actually never went back to Chicago. So by this time, I was in New York. And while I was in New York, I also met a guy named Robert Cummins, who had a record company called Indian Navigation. And I had caught his eye. So I think, if I get this right, I think the first record that the Japanese fellow, his name was Masahiko Yu, came, and we had a little bit of a language problem. And he thought that I would like to go to Chicago and make this record. And I thought he wanted to go to Chicago, when both of us would have preferred to stay in New York. Needless to say, we ended up in Chicago. So I made the record there. And I think that was the very first one I did, actually in the studio and recorded. Came back to New York. But then the next one I did, I think, was Indian Navigation's record, I think. But but that was not the first. The Indian Navigation, I think, was the first one released, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about this because it's a little bit fuzzy. But the reason I said there were three because after that I had joined Elvin Jones's band. So I was on tour with Elvin Jones, and Elvin did the surprise. And when I got to California, he said, "I got a record date for you." I was surprised. He had secured a recording for me. It was under my own name, and he was on the record.
Wow.
And and that was for the great contemporary label, Lester Koenig. So I did that record. Now I'm trying to remember which was actually the first one that was released, which most people would think of as my first record, you know, in terms of the one.
Okay. But
they were all recorded just about in the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, within a month or two apart.
Right.
So I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, I don't really remember which is actually the first one or the second, but those three came pretty close together.
Can you describe what you were doing at that time?
I was playing with Elvin Jones. I was working in his band.
But I mean, musically, is it possible to put a description on the kind of music?
I was fresh in New York, so I was open to everything. I had joined Cecil McBee's band. I was playing also with Mickey Bass. You know, and I got the job with McBee's band. Well, actually, I first was with Gene Lee. That was the first New York job I ever had. And, you know, she passed away not too long ago. And Henry Threadgill had that job. He needed to go back to Chicago for something, and he asked me to fill in for him, and I did. And it was a great success, and so they extended us another week. So I was with her. While I was doing that, I was, you know, just getting around New York, you know, getting around, learning people, you know, hanging out, finding and meeting people. I then sat in with Mickey Bass and got hired to play. He had a month of Sundays, and so I had after the Gene Lee thing, so I was working with him. So that kind of music was real straight. He was at Michael Carvin, and it was very mainstream. Gene Lee was a little more experimental, you know, a little bit more, but she was a vocalist, but still, it was a little more experimental. Then then Cecil McBee came, and I sat in with Cecil McBee, and John Stubblefield he got a call to go with Nat Adderley, and so Cecil called me, and I was playing with his band. Now that was more with the vamps and the, you know, kind of, it was mainstream to McCoy, Tyner-ish, you know what I mean? You know, kind of, I don't know. See, categories are very difficult for me. You know, but I was playing that, so I'm doing these three kinds of music at the same time. You know, and then the loft scene sort of came up. You know, with all these more progressive experimental music. So I was doing that also. So I was doing a lot of music, and I found myself having my feet in various camps.
I guess so.
Yeah.
And it probably hasn't changed all that much, has it?
No, because I like to. You know, I think there's. I believe in what Duke Ellington said. There's only two kinds of music, good and bad.
Yeah. What was it like playing with Elvin Jones?
Great.
Yeah.
I mean, John Coltrane was one of my biggest influences, and to be able to have worked with everyone that was in that great band. Yeah. And I did, everyone except for Jimmy Garrison, because he had passed on before I got. Yeah. But I'm working with McCoy Tyner today. I mean, in fact, I have a tour with him this summer. Summer tour, and scheduled to go to Las Vegas with him next month. So, and I've gone to Japan with him, and I've recorded with him, and so I still work with McCoy on and off. And Elvin Jones, I was some years with him. So working with Elvin was great. I mean, you know, to have that power, that drummer that propelled Coltrane, and to understand what that meant, you know. Not just to hear it, but to feel it and be a part of it was, for me, a very great thing.
Those of us who don't know him, when you watch him, you get the impression that this could be a mean person.
Oh, he's the sweetest guy you ever want to meet.
Isn't that interesting? Because I think it's something about, in fact, I just saw a photo today of him, and he was playing, and he got this look on his face, you know, like, wow.
That's called intense concentration.
I guess so. But I'm glad to hear that he's, like, not...
No, he's a great guy.
Yeah.
Working with him was an education. It was a pleasure. It was a dream come true. It was a lot of things for me. It was one of the best times of my musical life.
Here's kind of a hard question, I think, but are you a type of improviser that thinks of technical things while you're playing, as far as, here comes this chord, I know what scales and everything goes with it, and I can choose? I mean, is it possible to talk about what you think about when you're improvising?
Well, yeah, I try not to think, actually. It sort of depends if the music is fresh to me and new, like if I'm playing something that just, you know, that I don't know, that I have to look at, read, or something like that, then I'm forced to think to a point. But I've spent many years trying to, you know, learning things to forget them. And I feel that it's more important to feel. The thinking process for me is done when I'm practicing and when I'm learning a song. And I try to work on those kinds of things then. But when I get up on the bandstand, I'm interested in playing music, making music. And I think that to think, I don't think we can think that fast to capture the music, you know, the spontaneity. If you think, by the time you think something, the music has already moved on. So I don't think. I try very hard not to think. You know, I use my ears, and I mean, I can recognize a chord if I have to look at something and read it. I don't have to think about what scales go. I know it, so I try to do that. So I don't really think about that. I'm a technical player in terms of I understand the technical aspects of harmony. You know, I understand harmony and theory, and I have my own systems and harmonic devices that I use and things like that. But I usually apply that mental energy prior to playing. When I get there and play, I try to clear my mind of all things and let the inspiration and thing come to me, so that I can react and act in a moment's notice.
What's this like for you today, being successful in the music business? Has it changed in the last, let's say, 10 years?
Yes, very much. I'm not sure it's changed for the better. It's changed. I have questions about it. The institutionalization of the music has been good on one end, and I think it's not good on another end. I think that the industry has the standards and the concepts that they projected as to what is acceptable, you know, in the industry, has for the first time gotten musicians feeling that the idea is to look backwards instead of looking forward. And I think the music has always looked forward with respect to its history. But I mean, the industry, the idea of being an individual and being original is less strong today than it was in the past, I think.
And you think that the record companies don't encourage the individuality?
No, I think the record companies encourage musicians who sound like other musicians, musicians who are going back 10, 20, 30 years and trying to play like the people who invented and created that music at that time, and sort of regurgitate, almost like a repertory concept, you know, and as opposed to the industry encouraging and signing and promoting original thinking musicians and artists, and to try to take the music further. You know, we've always looked forward. You think of the greats, the greats. Let's talk about the greats, the major exponents of the music that we all have come to admire and hold up,
right,
as the defining factors, right?
Yeah.
You look at people like Monk, Charlie Parker, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong. These are Billie Holiday. You know, when you look at these people, what they have one thing in common, and that is they were all original. Louis Armstrong was doing nothing that anybody else was doing. In fact, Mal Waldron I worked with Mal Waldron, and Mal Waldron told me once that a musician would come and hear a guy play, and if he was doing something that the musician had been doing for himself, he would probably stop doing that to try to do something different. The originality was a very important thing. You listen to the sound between a Coleman Hawkins and a Lester Young, or Ben Webster and a Lester Young. You can hear that Lester Young was completely about being his own man. You know that story about in the band, and I think it was Fletcher Henderson's, I don't know if it's Fletcher Henderson's wife or somebody's wife.
Hampton, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah,
no,
I don't want to.
I know. We don't want to misquote.
I don't want to misquote.
He had to replace Coleman Hawkins.
Yes, and
Yes.
they took him, Lester Young, down in the basement and played all these records of Coleman Hawkins and asked him to sing. And Lester replied, "If you want him, then you hire him." So this Thelonious Monk, his style, and you look at all the great McCoy, Tyner, Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell, as far as pianists go, Bill Evans, you listen to these pianists, Wynton Kelly, Red Garland. They sound different. They have their own sounds. Andrew Hill, saxophone players, from Chu Berry to Lester Young, to Coleman Hawkins, to Ben Webster, Ornette Coleman, Charlie Parker, Eric Dolphy.
I'm wondering if, because of the so much education going on with jazz now, that we've dissected everything they do, and there's so much for people to copy, that's how they end up.
Well, that's the institutionalization. That's what I meant by it's good on one hand. I mean, it preserves what they've done in a way, which I think is good, but the methodology and the thinking process for acquiring the knowledge. And I think that this music really is a different kind of, I think it really requires a different type of education. The standards, the rules, and the things to get the spirit and the essence of the music is different than what the institutions, the kinds of rules that apply to institutions. I think there is a danger of it becoming a dead music, in a way like classical music, if it continues this. Classical music, if you think about it, the great composers, Beethoven, all people do is continually reinterpret the same thing. What was exciting about it is to hear Beethoven play, or to hear Bach,
Yeah.
That's and there's nothing wrong. See, I don't have a problem with the repertory concept, and people. I think there's a place for everything, but don't eliminate the other part, and that's what I'm afraid is we're in danger of. And if the powers that be, we're not fostering and encouraging artists to be artists. We're saying you have to be commercial, you have to subscribe to this way of doing a thing, and then maybe you'll sell records, maybe we'll sign you, maybe this, maybe that.
Yeah.
And I think we're sort of insulting the listening public as well, and considering them to be not as intelligent, or assuming that they're not as intelligent, or that they can't choose their own. Let them listen to and choose what they like. I mean, when I first heard Charles Mingus on record, he was doing something I had never heard music do before. I was deeply involved in R&B and this music, and I heard this thing. I forget the record that Charles did, but the name is, and it stopped me because it was completely out of, you know, of what people listen to and consider the normal. And I had never heard it, and I thought, wow, how did he just think of that, to do that, you know? And I think a lot of people could have that experience. You know, it doesn't matter. That's the experience people got with Louis Armstrong.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, nobody was doing, how did he think to do this?
Right.
Something that you never heard before. But you can't find those things if you don't let people give them
Right.
the green light to look and search and, you know, and be experimental with that. And that's what I'm afraid is happening with that's what I see in terms of the music business.
Yeah.
You know, many people think, so I said, well, what kind of, well, you can create music, you can try to identify a market, and then create some music to fit the market.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, this is the way a lot of people make music today, as opposed to make the music that's in your heart and soul and hope that there's a market, let a market be created for it.
Right. Yeah. You've got a lot of different projects going on right now. You're doing some Latin music, I see.
Yeah, I also played a lot of Latin music. I work with, you see, you know Machito? You've heard of Machito? You know Charlie Parker was in that band.
Yeah.
Dizzy Gillespie, Hubert Laws. So I mean, I feel, yeah, I was with Machito for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. And so I played a lot of Afro-Cuban music. I've been to Cuba, and I played with Irakere and Chicho Valdez and some of the great musicians down there. I got to hear and learn about Chano Pozo, and you know, I'd never met him, but a guy named Changuito, who was one of the legends in Cuba as a conguero. And as well, here with Tito Puente, I played with Tito Puente and Eddie Palmieri. I did a concert at Carnegie Hall with, where they brought McCoy, Tyner, and Eddie Palmieri together, and I played with that situation. It was great. So yeah, I've done a lot of Latin music. I love it. Barreto, you know, and I enjoy it very much.
And how about, I see you have a new thing with your father here.
Yes. Well, as I said, we play together. We've been playing together for years.
Yeah.
And this was his 75th birthday, which we celebrated here in New York at the Blue Note. And we had Diane Reeves as a guest with us, and we recorded there live, and that's what this record is, celebration of his 75th birthday. And so he and I together on there along with Diane Reeves.
What's it like trying to find, I guess we've probably already answered this question, but trying to find a record label these days?
These days it's more difficult than before, I think. It's unfortunate, but I would say the reason, there's been some not so good things that have happened to the record industry. So a couple of years ago, I think the Alliance, which was a large distribution, independent distributor, the nature of the record business has changed so that, and the way, you know, back when Columbia, it was Columbia before it was Sony and Warner Brothers, they had in-house public relations departments, in-house, everything was kind of in-house, you know. Their distribution was their, you know, they had huge distribution. Then later they started, the age of the specialists came on, and they started to farm things out to do, you know, everybody, the PR became, you know, as opposed to them trying to house everything, so that happened. Alliance distribution was one of them. They had sort of bought up all of these small distributions, so they had this major network of distribution throughout the country. And they went bankrupt a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and that sent a ripple effect through the distribution network, and a lot of distribution labels and small labels, independent labels, which were great. It was a great thing, and during the time when I was coming here, like India Navigation, that was a contemporary, these great labels that had really good music and recorded some great people. You know, I mean, with contemporary, that's one of the first labels Sonny Rollins recorded for, you know. And Ornette Coleman recorded on that label, you know, and those kinds of labels, it's now more difficult for them to exist. But those labels made it possible for artists to be artists and get names and do things, where as the major labels, the big ones, you were much more restricted in what you could do, you know, what they wanted you to do and what they would do for you. So because of that bankruptcy going with Alliance, a lot of the smaller labels couldn't survive. So a lot of them have disappeared, those labels, from, you know, that were really good. I think they were very good for the music. So now this is the thing that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
There's some independent labels coming up. A lot of musicians are doing their own labels these days.
Right. There's an awful lot of product out there.
That's a lot of product out there. And that's another thing. I mean, you can do a record, you know, in your own. You can. I mean.
You can, but should you?
That's again. You can, but you could, but should you? And you know, the stores are inundated with product that nobody knows who these people are, so it's difficult for people to go in there and look in a bin and see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of CDs in there, and they don't know what to buy. There's not a lot of radio these days, you know. So it's not an easy situation.
Yeah,
it's pretty difficult.
Wow.
So things have to change. I mean, things always change. You know, it's just a matter of being able to be, you know, to be able to make it through the change.
Right.
You know, but I hope that answers your question.
I know you had this computer experience and knowledge all this time. Has it come back to resurface in your life and help you out?
Yes, it's been there for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Since I started, you know, I got a scholarship for mathematics, which led me involved me into computers. For a while, as a hobby, I did programming. Some time back, I programmed software for businesses. I wrote programs for a bookstore, for a cosmetics company, you know, to name for a public relations firm, to name a couple, 2 or 3, and I enjoyed it because I was good at it, and you know, but as the technology advanced and the languages advanced, I started teaching myself other languages, of course, in order to do this. But I realized the languages started moving pretty fast, and if I was going to continue with this, I needed to go back to school and really get deep into it, or you know, and that was taking a lot of time away from music. So I decided not to do that. And I became a user, but a very savvy user. And I decided to use it in music. And as a result, I've been involved in the recording aspect. So, you know, the digital recording. Also, you know, I'm a producer, and I have produced records, both in the audiophile world. I don't know if you know what that is, but, and then the, just, you know, the multi-track, normal way of recording. So, so I'm versed in the technology and the way that audiophiles perceive and do things, as well as the digital world of Pro Tools, and you know, I work with Rocket Network, which is I'm now involved. This is a internet recording situation, so I'm involved with them. I work with eMagic, Logic Audio, that company, which is software for audio and MIDI music production, and I work with some, you know, music instrument makers like Korg, synthesizer makers, Korg, and people like that. So I'm involved in that kind of work. So I produce. I know how to. I'm an engineer. I can engineer, and I know all the technical stuff.
Wow.
You know, I'm involved in all of that. So as a producer, because I enjoy being in the studio and producing other artists as well as myself, but other artists, and so you need to have that kind of knowledge.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're being left behind in the world of technology in all aspects.
I like to look
career.
forward. You know, I think looking forward is a good thing. You try not to lose certain values, you know, values that have in the past that have shown to be real, truthful things that last. You know, things that are real. Those are important values, but we need to learn how to take those things and but with an eye to the future. You know, and keep innovating and continuing to add to that. That's what I try to do.
Excellent. Thanks so much for your time today.
All right, thank you.
And I hope the rest of the your events go well, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, same here. Okay.